trade protection on apparel, right? Because they've got a nice fashion industry in Italy that makes fashions that the Italians are really proud of. I think they're kind of bizarre, but that's just me. What the Italians won't tell you is how many Chinese workers have immigrated into Italy to make shoes, leather goods, and fashions. So again, you can either do international trade in the goods or you can do international trade in the factors of production. But Italy, again, is put on trade protections because they think of these industries as being prototypically Italian. Now, I only pick on the French and the Italian because they're easy to pick on, but a lot of countries actually do these kinds of things. And to just give you an idea, everybody know who Andy Grove is? Does anybody know who Andy Grove is? Right. So Andy Grove was the longtime chairman of Intel, watched it grow from nothing to the behemoth that it is today. And he, in a recent Business Week op-ed piece that has been picked up lots of other places, has actually been arguing for trade protectionism to protect many of the American industries that are prototypically thought of as American. And this has to do specifically with the high-tech industries, software and high-tech, semiconductors and other types of hardware and software. So, these are important to America. These are American industries. We need to protect them. Okay? So national pride argument actually is out there. Now, again, if there is something extra beneficial about having a wine industry, as large a wine industry as France has, as large a leather good or shoe industry or fashion industry as Italy does, as large a semiconductor or software industry as the United States does, there is a way to get that. It doesn't have to be a trade barrier, right? We already know how to do it. It's called a production subsidy. And it has fewer distortions than the trade barrier it does itself. Besides, the trade barrier is likely, at some point, to lead to a retaliation by our trading partners. So I don't know how many of you have been to the UK? Okay, good. How many of you have had UK wine? I know it sounds like an oxymoron. Come to think of it, it is an oxymoron. But believe it or not, Britain actually exports wine to France. I know we did that to Portugal in the Ricardian model, but it actually happens. It must be all the British expats that are living in France now, because I can't imagine anybody else would drink that stuff. But where was I going with that? I don't even remember now. But if there's something extra beneficial about maintaining an industry at a larger size than it would under free market competition, as apparently the French think about their wine industry and Grove thinks about our information technology industry, then first of all, notice we've got to try and measure or have some sort of idea what's the order of magnitude of the marginal external benefits that we're talking about. I mean, if we're just saying the marginal external benefits, okay, how big are they? Again, as I said last time, because we can use the data in the marketplace to get estimates of the slopes of the demand and supply curves, we can actually come up with a measurement of the production-consumption distortions. It's the marginal external benefits, which don't trade in a marketplace, therefore there's no price associated with it. Therefore, we don't know what that marginal external benefit curve actually looks like or where its position is in terms of vertical position, in terms of how high or how low it is. So that creates all sorts of controversy, as you might expect, in terms of how we're actually going to use that. Now, a sixth argument, the national defense argument. Oh, okay, you hear this all the time. We need to maintain a very strong industry in X, because if we ever go to war, we might not be able to import X, and we'll need it. Okay, what if that's true? What if that argument's true? If we go to a major war, the shipping lanes close down, and we can't get boots for American soldiers from China. This is an actual example. This argument was made by the American footwear industry, and we should not be dependent on China for boots for American soldiers, or by the way, for their uniforms, and particularly we should not be dependent upon the Chinese for the American flags that American soldiers wear on their arms of their uniforms. Okay? So, what do we know about this? If there's something extra beneficial, why not just subsidize it directly? Don't we want to know what the cost, as a country, as taxpayers, as politicians, as citizens, don't we really want to know what the cost of maintaining our military might is? You can tell that from a production subsidy if this is the way that you want to maintain a larger domestic industry. But there's several other ways of doing this, even without having a production subsidy. One is you can store a lot of stuff, right? We've got the petroleum oil reserves down in Louisiana and Texas with billions of barrels of oil stuck in old salt mines. Don't know that we can get it out, but we got it in. And so we've got all that oil. Well, if you can store oil, we already store critical supplies, funny metals that you can't get anyplace else. Why not just store a lot of uniforms, or a lot of boots, or a lot of shoulder patch American flags? So there are lots of ways of sustaining a military presence without having to worry about trade barriers to do so. Okay, now, the last argument, I should say the last in my series of arguments, I'm sure there are many more, is the income redistribution argument. We want to have a tariff so we can use the revenues to have some sort of income redistribution scheme going on in the country. So the government will receive the revenues and then reallocate that revenue to somebody. Maybe low-income individuals. Oh, it might be high-income individuals. Depends on who has the political power to determine what the reallocation might look like. Once again, the specificity rule would tell you this is not the right way to approach it. The right way to approach it is with a tax and subsidy or a tax and transfer program. If you have individuals in society that you want to penalize, and I use that loosely, just you want to raise their taxes, raise the price that they pay for things. Notice that's what consumers end up paying when you put on a tariff. They pay a higher price, so we could think of that as a tax increase on consumers, and then transfer that money to other groups in society. Notice if all you have is a tariff, then the money is getting transferred to the government, tariff revenues, as well as to producers. So again, it's one way of doing it. It may not be, it's clearly not the most direct way of affecting the income distribution, and it's definitely not the cheapest way of doing it. But you can accomplish that with this particular means. Now, yes? So it's kind of like saying there's a loss version, and some groups gain more and other groups that loss is so severe or something. Well, that's not this argument necessarily. That argument is probably the dying industry argument more, right? Because if you're in a dying industry, especially an industry that's on the verge of collapse, then all the owners of the factors of production are going to lose all their income. So why not have a tax on all the rest of us and use that money to help support that small group of people whose loss would be very, very substantial? That, by the way, that's a nice segue question, by the way, thank you very much. That does help us to explain sort of the politics of protection. So what we know from what we've just talked about is that almost all trade protection measures are going to end up reducing national economic welfare unless the marginal external benefits are very large. Right? They have to be very large because there's so much uncertainty associated with what they actually are. You want to be overly confident that they're big and offset the production and consumption distortions. But we look around, we got trade barriers all over the place. So we have to figure out why that's the case. Now remember, tariffs and import quotas are actually imposed by the government. So it's the government that's doing this. So the government must be doing it for reasons other than some sort of general feel about national economic welfare. So the first thing that we need to recognize is there ain't no such thing. Right? Earlier, we talked about country indifference curves, or sometimes called community indifference curves. But I can assure you that it's virtually impossible to figure out how to add up your individual indifference curves with all the rest of the people in the class, let alone everybody in the country. I mean, it's hard enough to figure out what our indifference curves look like. Nice theoretical concept, but it doesn't work all that well in terms of determining what they are. So if you realize that there's no such concept as national economic welfare, that is, we can't sort of homogenize everything that we feel about economic outcomes. What we can say, though, is that we get what society wants or thinks they want, sort of mirrored in government objectives. Assuming, of course, that the government is somewhat representative of the population, right? So in the U.S. and most democracies, we have votes where the politicians run around and promise you a bunch of things and we vote for them or against them. Somebody gets elected. They know what their broad constituency, at least 50% plus one, wants, or at least approved of the policies that they were promoting. So they take that as sort of, okay, this is what our national economic welfare might be. Now let's move policy in that particular direction. Well, totalitarian governments have their own objectives, right, which may, but probably don't, reflect the views and societies of the individuals. So in that case, national economic welfare is what the totalitarian government says it is. And let the chips fall where they may. So there, if you don't have a representative government, a government that's acting on behalf of the people, then this breaks down. But we don't have to worry about the politics in that case because the government generally has a nice army.
So there's no such thing as national welfare than the graph we see before, like consumer surplus.
Uh-huh.
So how can they use this?
Oh, well, so the question was, if there's no such thing as national economic welfare, how can we even talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus? We know that there is economic welfare, that individuals have economic welfare that changes depending upon relative prices and income levels, right? So we know that in the aggregate, if we say that we can add up your losses against my gains, that we can come up with some aggregate measure of economic welfare between the two of us or all members of society. So conceptually, there is a national welfare. It's just not that homogeneous summation of what all of our individual welfares are. Now remember, when we talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus, they're related to economic welfare, but those we can actually measure. So remember, if we know what that demand curve looks like, the demand curve is actually a willingness to pay curve, right? And we know what the actual price is. So today, the average price for standing room only at AT&T Park is $500. I'd rather take the $500, buy a new TV, watch it in high def at home with an adult beverage. But some people are spending $500. Some of the people who are spending $500 for standing room only were willing to pay an even higher price for that opportunity, right? So that's that consumer surplus that individual had. The difference between what I was willing to pay and what I actually had to pay. Now, the nice thing about StubHub and other auctions is they can be perfectly discriminating and they can eliminate most of that, or a substantial part of that consumer surplus. So we can measure that consumer surplus. The biggest problem with consumer and producer surplus is not, can we measure them? We can do that. What's the biggest problem with notions of consumer and producer surplus? Well, let's assume that it is accurate. It's as accurate as we can measure the slopes of the supply and demand curves.
Well, is it a problem like the voting process? Is one person, they might really, really want the policy, but they don't have one vote, and there's somebody who kind of doesn't want it?
Okay, we'll come back to that point in just a minute. I mean, that's an important point, but not on consumer surplus versus producer surplus. Well, yeah, but we can get close on that. I mean, again, if we've got enough data, enough various variable prices, we can estimate what as long as we can estimate what a demand curve looks like, and we know what the current price is, we can figure out the area underneath. No, their different incomes would still be incorporated in the market demand curve, where the market demand curve is. Okay, so just make sure you stay to the end of the lecture. I'll wait and tell you later. That's terrible, isn't it? Okay, so when we think about the politics that are involved here, what we have to realize is that in a democratic society, without term limits, or at least without effective term limits, one of the things that happens is politicians like to be reelected. I don't know why anyone wants to run in the first place, but to be reelected seems really, really nasty. So when you are part of the political process, then that's what means in a representative society why your position needs to try and reflect your constituency. Or you need to try and change your constituency's minds about what it is that they would like to support, right? So either the politician needs to reflect the constituency, or the politician needs to change the constituency's views of what it is that they think that they want to have. Well, there's a long political science literature about how these things come about, which I know a tiny amount about. But three things that are typically talked about is electoral competition. That is, when politicians run for office, they generally, one will promise one thing, the other will promise the other thing, right? And however society sees it at that particular moment, that person wins. So if you've been paying any attention to the current election, Gary Brown has one vision, and Meg Whitman has another vision, and presumably each of them will gather a bunch of supporters, and that helps to generate the outcomes that we get. Well, when we think about trade policies, we need to think about how the gains and losses are distributed. So this comes back to, in part, back to the question that was asked earlier. So if we think about the gains and losses that are distributed, how those gains and losses are distributed. So most people would say that, or probably agree with, I don't know that most polls show that most people would agree with the following statement. If a few people experience huge losses and most people experience very small gains, then many more people are getting a benefit than are suffering a loss. So the people who are suffering a loss are going to vote against you if you're for that policy, but you've got all these people who are benefiting from it. So they're going to vote for you. So the beneficiaries greatly outnumber the losers, which means that that's a policy that ought to win. And just the opposite, right? If you have a very tiny number of people who get big gains, but a large number of people that get losses, as long as you recognize that you've got a loss, that's a policy that's likely to lose. But that's exactly what happens with import protection, right? So remember, when we import at any particular price, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So the decline in consumer surplus will always be greater than the increase in producer surplus. The difference is that those consumers are multitudinous, lots and lots of them. So we got lots of people with very small losses and a few with very big gains. So that's a policy that should fail. But we've got trade policies all over the place. So it clearly doesn't work this way. So what this actually shows is if we were to line up voters in their preferred tariff rate from those who prefer the lowest tariff to those who prefer the highest. So we're going to look at what we're looking at is the preferred tariff rate. What we might see is a curve that looks like this. That is, most consumers, if they recognize the actual economic impact of a tariff on them, most consumers who are voters would actually prefer a very low rate, right? We all love low prices more than high prices, so low tariff rate should be preferable to a higher tariff rate. So we should have a large number of people who want a very, very low rate. But there are a few people, those who are going to receive the producer surplus, who would like a really big tariff, right? Because that's what expands our producer surplus. So the benefits would be very, very great. So what do we see? In this, votes are 50% plus 1. So all we have to do is find out where the median voter is. And in this case, what it should tell us is that the preferred tariff rate should be very low. Unfortunately, the actual tariff rates generally aren't. So again, it's a model that seems to make sense, but at least in terms of international trade policy, it breaks down almost completely. So a second and probably better approach is that what we call collective action. And so in collective action, what we recognize is that there's a public good aspect to proposing a policy that is going to be beneficial or harmful to lots of people, whether they participate in the group or not. Right? So let's suppose that there's a big student march on Sacramento, right? And the march is successful, the legislature votes more money for the university, tuition goes down. Well, we don't have tuition, fees go down, right? Notice as a student, you would be the recipient of that reduction in fees, whether you went on the march or not. So you've received some of the public good. All the people who organized it and worked hard for it, they get a benefit, but the benefit is actually expanded to lots and lots of different beneficiaries. So this is collective action, a group action, with a public good aspect. So the way in which collective action is thought to deal with international trade policy is that suppose we have large losses in total, right? This is a typical tariff. We know the loss of consumer surplus is greater than producer surplus, but there's small losses on any of the individual consumers. So again, let's think back to sugar import quotas. It's been estimated that in 2008, the average cost to an American consumer, an individual, is $2 a month. And that's not, by the way, buying sugar in the supermarket, because we don't actually consume most of the sugar we consume as sugar. It's already in processed foods and other types of things, pastries and sweets and candies. Oh, that's right, Halloween's coming up. I don't remember that. So what we see is $2 a month. Okay. Now, right after class, I know there's a baseball game, but right after class, I'm going to organize a letter writing and protest march down to the Commerce Department Border Patrol offices, because I think we ought to protest this $2 a month payment that we make on average for sugar. How many of you are with me? Come on. We can get those sugar prices down. Right? Who cares? Right? But there are 305